Czechia has just elected a new parliament. Andrej Babiš, seen here, and his ANO party scored a massive victory even they didn't quite believe. Let's unpack how that happened and what it means for Czechia's political future. Firstly, the populist catch-all party of former PM Andrej Babiš scored a resounding victory, gaining nearly 35% of the vote. As Babiš admitted himself, even he didn't expect to score so high. You see, internal projections show that ANO would gain only around 26%, as Babiš said. And here we are with almost 10% more in the end. That clearly shows one thing. People in Czechia desperately wanted a change. And that's also clear from the unusually high turnout. See, the turnout actually pushed close to 69%, which makes it the third highest turnout since the breakup of Czechoslovakia in 1993. Now, if we agree that elections are basically a barometer of public mood, that mood wasn't exactly great in Czechia before this election. The outgoing Czech government, led by the center-right Spolu coalition, was blamed for just about everything. For a lack of modernization in Czechia, for the record inflation rate that Czechia saw in 2022 and 23, the record high energy prices, or the overpriced housing, which means that buying property has basically become a dream for many, especially the young generations. Overall, Czechia has actually become one of the most expensive countries to live in compared to wages in the entire European Union. I mean, it doesn't really matter that Fiala, the prime minister, is not entirely to blame for none of those things. Many factors, like the inflation rate, for example, or of course the energy prices, have their roots outside of the country, be it the COVID pandemic or Russia's illegal war against Ukraine, which both caused supply chain issues and rising prices, including energy, for example. But that doesn't matter to voters. What does matter is how well the government is able to communicate all of this to them. And it's fair to say that the government's communication strategy was absolutely terrible at times. In that atmosphere, it was quite easy for Babiš actually to successfully offer his buffet of easy promises. You have cheaper food, cheaper energy, better pensions, and faster decisions. Never mind that if implemented, all of those promises would cost the Czech economy hundreds of billions of crowns in debt. They just want the promise, and Babiš gave it to them. Now, Babiš and his catch-all party succeeded much more than actually predicted, as we already said. And a side effect of this is also that the more extremist parties either didn't succeed at all, or they did worse than they hoped. Take the pro-Russian fifth column in Czech politics, the Communists, as an example. This time they actually ran rebranded under the name of Stačilo, meaning enough, together with a few other extremists and anti-establishment candidates. For a long time, it looked like their campaign might actually work and return them into high politics. Some polls right before the election started even gave them a chance at around 10% of the ballot. But in the end, they scraped barely 4%, which means that they missed the 5% threshold that you need to actually get into parliament. And that may be proof that the Soviet nostalgia market is finally shrinking. Or the high turnout may actually be to blame. The SPD, which is the Czech knockoff of the German AfD, being anti-EU, anti-migration, sometimes even anti-NATO, and staunchly against Ukraine and perpetually angry about something, also under-delivered. What happened, most likely? Well, I think that many protest votes actually parked their votes with ANO and Babiš himself, treating him as the safer bet. After all, small parties always run the risk of falling below the 5% line, which is very dangerous. And in the last election, for example, in 2021, it left nearly 1 million votes wasted because the small parties ended up just below the 5% threshold, and that million of votes went unrepresented in the parliament. Voters remembered that risk and that pain, and that's why they likely chose the devil they know over the fringe that they might never see again. Now, the next trend we've seen is the breakthrough of yet another new political party. You see, over the past 15 years or so, we've got used to a new party appearing every single election cycle in Czechia, and 2025 was no different. The Motorists are a relatively new party, also running on an anti-establishment platform, reform and anti-Brussels as well, of course. And as their name already implies, their main agenda point is preserving the rights of ordinary drivers, whatever that means. They rallied against Brussels green rules. Everything green is a bad thing for them, against any and all parking restrictions, and the supposedly tyrannical idea that city centers shouldn't resemble motorways or parking lots. The motorists polled in over 6% of the vote, and that means that they secured 13 seats in the lower house. And that also means that they might actually become the kingmakers for Babiš, who desperately needs coalition partners to be able to get his majority. You see, the two parties, the motorists on the one hand and ANO on the other, actually share a lot of the populist DNA, so I think a coalition between ANO and the motorists is actually very likely. The problem is that such a coalition is still short of a majority. You need at least 101 seats to have a majority in the Czech parliament, and they would fall short of that majority. So that means that Babiš will likely have to flirt with the SPD as well, and most likely for external support. It will be an awkward political threesome, if there ever was one. Because the SPD is seen as too extreme even by Babiš himself, who also, by the way, deeply dislikes the SPD leader, Tomio Okamura. So an open coalition with them is unlikely for Babiš. Instead, we should expect a lot of backroom deals to get Babiš his majority in other ways. For example, it will probably have to come in exchange for a cushy job for the SPD, likely Okamura himself. He is speculated to become the Speaker of the House in exchange for the handful of votes of the SPD that Babiš and the motorists will need. Now, needless to say, such a government will be inherently unstable and most likely prone to internal conflict or even blackmail by the SPD, or maybe sometimes even the motorists, who might always threaten to topple the government if their demands are not met. So the big question is how long such a government can survive. If you're wondering whether this means that Czechia is about to exit the EU or NATO, relax. It's actually not. You see, Babiš may well be complaining about the evil Brussels, mainly for the cameras, but he is also one of the wealthiest people in the country, and his business empire thrives in a stable, Western-anchored country that Czechia is. He's a pragmatist, not an ideologue, and ideology doesn't pay dividends. The EU, and by extension NATO and the US, do. That sets him apart, actually, from people like Orbán in Hungary or Fico in Slovakia. Babiš's main interest is to preserve his wealth, not being friendly with dictators in the East, because first and foremost, he doesn't have any business interest in the East. So what likely will change is the rhetoric. As a casual party, ANO needed to satisfy the most extremist voters who would have otherwise voted for the communists or the SPD. Babiš succeeded, mainly by being more aggressive on the campaign trail, but when it comes to actual decisions, I don't really expect a lot to change. See, Babiš needs to keep the door to the West open, and for that, he will need to stay pragmatic and reasonable. And now a very positive trend, and I really do mean it, in this election is that a record number of women and young people have made it into the parliament this time around. See, nearly a third of the newly elected MPs will be women, the most in Czechia's history actually. Most notably, we're talking about the Liberal Pirate Party, who will now have 15 women in the club and only 3 men. The mayors, on the other hand, which is the other Liberal party in the parliament, will have the youngest MP ever, a 21-year-old woman who hasn't even graduated yet, but who can now decide on education laws. Funny. Overall, we have seen young candidates all across the spectrum make the cut, including the motorists, by the way. And in many cases, those young people have leapt over long-serving politicians on their party list thanks to preferential votes. And that's not just symbolic, I think. You see, a younger, more gender-balanced parliament may change what gets talked about and how. Issues like housing, childcare, digital rights, and mental health may now get more airtime and more attention. Let's see if it leads to any tangible results, but just the trend in itself is absolutely positive. Now, overall, the 2025 election in Czechia proves that voters desperately did want a change. Extremists may have lost a bit of their magic, but they still do play a role in politics and might actually become the kingmakers for Babiš and decide what the next government looks like. Now, it's clear that for Czechia, the road ahead will absolutely be bumpy, but we shouldn't expect any major changes in especially the foreign policy orientation. In any way, we'll be following the developments in Czechia, so if you're interested in what happens in the country, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of the future content. And also, as always, thanks to everyone already supporting me on herohero.co/pracpulse. This has been Jan. Until next time.